The child was sentenced to 9 years in jail for the murder of his newborn sister, but as he uttered his final words, the judge changed his mind, which shocked everyone. Footsteps echoed in the courtroom hallway. 2 police officers led Miguel Angel Suarez, who was only 12 years old, to room 7. His little feet were wearing worn-out shoes. The blue shoes his mom had given him for the start of the school year were not fast enough to keep up with the adults who were following him. One of the cops said something in a professional and caring way that the defense attorney Ricardo Mendoza heard and understood. While waiting by the large wooden doors, Miguel whispered to Mendoza, bending down to the child's level, "Remember what we did?" I talked about staying calm, and the boy gave a small nod without raising his eyes. His wrists, bruised by the handcuffs, shook slightly from the ground. In the room, the rumble of the crowd was hushed. As soon as the doors opened, everyone immediately stopped talking and stood up as Judge Gabriel Ramirez walked in. He was a 60-year-old man who had been in the legal field for 30 years and was known for being strict and fair. The judge ordered the defendant to take a seat. I have never had to judge such a young defendant for such a serious crime. He adjusted his glasses and looked over the papers in front of him. We are present for the sentencing hearing. Miguel Angel Suarez Morales versus Elena Morales. The state case. Miguel's mother squeezed her in the front row. Over the past few weeks, Carlos's hand has left a lasting mark on both of them. Elena had lost so much weight that the clothes Carlos was wearing appeared to belong to someone else, and his hair had a greater number of grey hairs. A woman sitting behind her said, "You must be very strong." Maria Elena answered in, "How can I be strong when I've already lost my baby and could lose my son?" questioned Javier, the lawyer, in a whisper. Asked Javier, the lawyer. Rosales stood up. He was a tall, thin man who was known for being careful, and the prosecutor wants to construct robust cases, Your Honor, prior to the reading of the sentence. Mr. Prosecutor Judge Ramirez agreed to create a final summary of the facts established in court. September 15th, Rosales sets sail on a Maria around 23:45. Suarez Morales, who was only 3 weeks old, was found dead in her crib. Asphyxiation was the cause of death. Elena sobbed, and Carlos put his arm around her. The prosecutor said that the proof was conclusive because the defendant's fingerprints were found on a pillow that was used to commit the crime. In this case, a family friend reported witnessing the defendant leave the victim's room, approximately the time of death. At that moment, the room's door quietly opened and a middle-aged woman rushed in. Miguel's teacher, Carmela Valdez, was seated in the last row and requested Rosales received approval from the school to be present. Rosales continued by stating that experts have provided testimony regarding the defendant. His teacher reported that he exhibited erratic behavior in the days leading up to the event, as well as moments of mental instability. There were absences from classes and one instance where the defendant broke down in tears for no apparent reason. During break, Carmen moved around in her seat in a way that wasn't comfortable. Your Honor, Mendoza, given to her with the best of intentions during her statement, now weighed heavily on her mind. The defense stood up and informed the court that the child in question is 12 years old. Until recently, he was an excellent student with no history of violence. I object to what Your Honor, Rosales said. We have already. During the trial, these issues were talked about in detail, and the judge answered, I understand we are currently in the sentencing phase. Miguel stayed seated and seemed to be unaware of everything going on around him. Miguel whispered to Mendoza. He looks ahead with his hands cuffed and seems to be seeing something very far away. She leaned toward him and asked, Do you want to say anything before the sentence? He didn't say anything, so Dr. Patricia had to wait. The forensic psychologist who had examined Miguel sat in her chair and watched the whole thing with full attention. Sessions. The boy had kept the same stony silence, only replying with gestures to the most basic questions. The judge continued to ask questions and review all the provided records due to the seriousness of the crime. Specifically, the psychological tests indicate that the accused is aware that his actions were wrong. Elena slowly rocked in her seat, which made her think of how she used to hold her baby. Carlos kept his eyes on his son, as if he were trying to figure out an impossible problem. Just then the door opened. Once more, a tired-looking man entered the room. It was Roberto, Elena's brother, who moved in briefly to help with the baby's care after she was born. This court has carefully, the judge continued, taking into account the defendant's age, but also the planned nature of the crime, as demonstrated by witnesses. We cannot ignore statements and forensic proof. A ray of sunlight came in through the room's high windows. By briefly illuminating Miguel's face, everyone could see who he truly was. In a world full of adults and consequences too big for him to handle, Miguel felt lost and scared. The judge's words, "This court finds you guilty of first-degree murder," echoed through the room, addressed to Suarez Morales. "You receive a 9-year sentence due to your age, a mitigating factor, and the seriousness of the crime you committed. Years in a youth detention center." The gavel struck the table with such intensity that the room shook violently. Roberto was in the back of the room, his hands covering his face. "No!" Carmen, the teacher, yelled. "He's just a child!" The judge yelled in court, ordering him to stand up. Miguel finally looked up from his gavel. He surveyed the room as if it were an unfamiliar place. He paused briefly to gaze at his uncle Roberto, who had a vague expression on his face. Elena began to cry as she tried to talk to her son, but the police stopped her. "My child, Mrs. Suarez," the judge spoke up in a softer tone and said, "You will have time to say goodbye to your son before he is transferred." As they started to move Dr. Roas, he asked Miguel to help him leave the room. She saw something that bothered her. As Uncle Roberto walked toward the exit, Miguel's body tightened up and more shaking occurred in the hands. The San Unheld Juvenile Facility will receive the suspect. As the room started to empty, the judge from the detention center told everyone that the session was over. Dr. Roas stayed to watch the scene, and she started to feel uneasy. There was something in Miguel's eyes, in his silence, in his... For the time being, Miguel Ángel Suarez Morales, who was 12 years old, was the suitable candidate. Until now, he was the city's youngest killer, and no one else knew the real story behind the tragedy. Destroyed his family. The room slowly began to empty. The reporters who had been quiet during the session now spoke up. They gathered around the exit, their voices blending into a deeper rumble as they discussed the case. Elena called Maria while she was chasing after her friend, walking slowly toward the exit. "You can't leave like this. Please wait for the car." Carlos stopped holding his wife. "Dear Maria, you're right. There are reporters outside." What did Elena answer in a voice that didn't seem to be there? "My baby is dead, my son, my Miguel." Roberto's footsteps echoed in the nearly empty hallway as he approached them. "I'll take you home, my car is in the back," he said. "The parking lot will keep the press away." Lawyer Mendoza walked up to the group with his bag pressed against his chest. "I need to talk to you about the appeals process, Mr. and Mrs. Suarez. We still have choices." Carlos quickly asked, "What choices didn't you have? What did my son do?" He remained silent and did not attempt to defend himself. As a result, Mendoza persisted, lowering his voice and remaining silent. All of this could serve as grounds for an appeal, and Dr. Roas concurs that he requires additional mental health care evaluations. Dr. Roas, who was taking notes, looked up when she heard her name. She approached the group and adjusted her thin-framed glasses. "Mr. and Mrs. Suarez," she said, "I need to speak to you." Voice: "There are certain aspects of Miguel's behavior that truly concern me. He doesn't exhibit typical violent behavior." Child: "Why didn't you say that during the trial?" Carlos asked, his voice breaking. "Yes," I replied to the doctor, but Elena interrupted her. "Without Miguel's help and without him talking, my son is not aggressive. He was extremely happy when Ana Maria was born, but you don't know him personally. He put up his own pictures and sang her a lullaby. Roberto cleaned up." "Elisa, you should rest at home because this week has been really hard, teacher." Carmen, who had been quiet while listening, spoke up. There was something about her that captivated everyone. Miguel was always a unique kid. He was sensitive and looked out for his friends the day all of this happened. Had it been different, but he wasn't different as a person. How was Dr. Roos quick? Carmen paused as she took out her notebook, looking at Elena with worry. During break, he wasn't as loud as usual, and I found him sitting alone on the stairs. I walked up to him and saw that he was crying. I asked him what was wrong, but all he did was look at me with such fear in his eyes. Elena put her hand on her chest and asked, "Why didn't you tell me this before I talked about it in court?" Carmen was uncomfortably twirling her purse, but the prosecutor used it as proof. Because of his strange behavior, the back doors opened and 2 police officers walked out with Miguel. The group fell. My love Elena watched in silence as the boy walked with his head down and his steps slow and steady, trying to get close. Roberto stopped her though and told her, "One of the cops can let you see your son before the transfer, but now we have to take Miguel," who was escorting him to the processing room, briefly raised his eyes. His eyes are usually warm brown, like his mother's. For a moment, the electric hallway light nearly turned black. He looked at his uncle Roberto and his. While Miguel was on the phone with Mendoza, Dr. Roas, who was closely observing, scribbled something in her notebook. "Do you want to say something to your parents?" was asked softly. He remained silent, and the police continued with their plan. Elena said quickly as she moved away from the boy and down the long hallway, "I need to go to the bathroom." Maria offered to go with the group, but Roberto stepped in and said, "I'll go with her." He was following his sister, Dr. Rouse. Her eyes narrowed with worry as she watched them walk away. Something about the way her family operated caught her attention. She couldn't figure out why some parts of the puzzle didn't fit with Mr. Mendoza. Finally, she asked, "May I talk to you alone?" The lawyer nodded, and they both walked down the hallway. As they walked, the doctor quickly looked through her notes. She said in a low voice, "There's something we're not seeing." "What do you mean?" Mendoza Miguel's asked. "I've worked with him on his reactions, his selective silence, and especially his body's responses to certain triggers. Traumatized children for 20 years, and there are trends that cause a heartbreaking scream from the "It was Elena's voice in the women's bathroom." Carlos sprinted towards the sound. Then Maria and the other people who were there when Elena was found on her knees, holding a crumpled Roberto, tried to calm Ana Maria down, while I screamed with my baby Elena. "My babies! How did this happen?" Dr. Rouse asked, as he looked at the scene from her mind was working very fast. The way Miguel looked at his uncle made her think. The way Roberto moved around the family was a mystery to her, but for now, it was only speculation. While she thought about it, in her mind, a 12-year-old boy was facing a 9-year sentence for a crime she was beginning to investigate. The suspect discovered a far darker truth than anyone could have imagined. It was getting dark in the city, and somewhere in the Miguel Angel Suarez Morales kept a secret that was heavier than all the chains in the world that the sand freed. The juvenile detention center was a big, grey building on the edge of the city that had been there for 2 weeks. Even though it had been a while since the first sentence, Miguel Ángel Suárez's case was still the major story in the local news. "How is he eating?" Elena inquired as she sat opposite Sandra Gutierrez, the social worker, in the visiting room. She nervously played with the edge of her black shawl, the same one she had worn to Ana Maria's funeral. Sandra looked at her. "She notes that he has improved slightly. At least he now consumes half of his meals. Is he still not better?" Carlos leaned forward to talk. The dark lines under his eyes indicated that he hadn't slept much, prompting me to comment. "Sandra, even though our staff psychologist, Dr. Torres, has seen some changes in what behavioral changes did he implement?" Elena's voice sounded worried. He began drawing primarily during his therapy sessions, and Sandra took some sketches out of his sketchbook. The drawings on the sheets from her folder are pretty intense for a kid his age. The image depicted dark forms threatening shadows over what appeared to be a crib. Elena had to hold back tears when she saw them. Gutierrez spoke up and asked Attorney Mendoza, who had been taking notes in silence, "Do you think Miguel is in a condition?" Sandy was asked to attend the review meeting next week, but her response was, "Honestly, I don't know." As soon as the door to the room opened, Dr. Torres rushed in, as Judge Ramirez had demanded he be there. He said, "Excuse me, I'm just adjusting my glasses, but I think you should see this." The group then followed Dr. Torres led them to a small viewing room featuring a one-way glass window. From there they could see Miguel taking notes at a table. With pencils and paper in front of him, Dr. Roos was already there, carefully watching how long has he been acting this way? She asked the doctor, her eyes never leaving the glass. "About an hour," she said. "Torres, it began soon after we told him about the hearing next week." Miguel was sketching rapidly on his small tablet. He almost continuously moved his hands over the paper. Every once in a while, he would stop and stare closely at his work. Eleanor swallowed. "Can I come in to see him?" Sandra and Torres exchanged a quick glance. "I'm not sure that's right." "Please hear my son," Sandra said, starting the best part of the scene. After giving it some thought, Torres said, "Miguel was watching the lesson, not looking up from his drawing, when Elena entered the room." Love whispered to Elena, who was sitting next to him. "Mom is here," she said. Miguel's pencil stopped. He froze for a moment, but then continued to move quickly across the paper. "What are you drawing, my dear Elena?" Miguel quickly wrapped his arms around the paper and placed it behind the glass. Dr. Roas was quickly taking notes. My love said, her voice breaking, "Protective behavior over his pictures could be a sign of a secret. I worry a lot about you, your dad, your teachers, and even Uncle Roberto. About you every day." When Roberto's name came up, Miguel's pencil broke in half in his hand. Dr. Roos leaned forward to her. "Did you see that?" Carlos inquired, his gaze narrowing as he digested the words. This is the second time he's heard about his uncle, and his response is, like the first time, I saw something similar going on in the room. Eleanor kept trying to get in touch with her son Miguel, my "What do you want to tell me about your life?" Miguel looked up for the first time, his eyes meeting his mother's house, and for a moment it looked like he was going to speak. Mrs. Suarez noticed a slight tremble on his lips as the door flew open. Roberto ran in and said, "I'm sorry, but it's important. There's been a problem at home." The impact happened right away. Miguel jumped, threw the chair, and backed into the corner. Elena stood up to follow him, but Roberto stopped her. "Elena, please hurry up. There was a fire in the kitchen, but I don't care about that." Elena screamed as she attempted to free my son. "Needs me, Elena. Please." Roberto grabbed her arm and said, "Firefighters are on their way." "There, they need you to sign." The tension in the room was palpable. Miguel from his corner was clearly shaking his head as he looked at his uncle with a mix of fear and anger in his eyes. Sir Dr. Torres stepped in and said, "This is a controlled environment. You can't just walk in like this." Roberto replied, "I'm sorry," but Elena saw a clear tear between her brother and her son and said, "Miguel, I love you and I'll be back soon." "Okay, Mom has to." That's when it happened. The stress, pain, and Elena couldn't handle the quick interruption. Her eyes rolled back and she fell to the ground. Several voices yelled at her. Carlos and Roberto both rushed to hold her while Dr. Torres summoned assistance. Services. During the chaos, something amazing took place. Miguel stepped forward, his lips moving slowly. She was the first to notice everyone's silence and instructed them to stop. Miguel is trying to talk, except for Eleanor's soft moans as she started to wake up. The room was dead quiet. Don't Miguel's. Because he hadn't used his voice in weeks, it was barely a whisper. "Don't touch her." All of them stopped moving. Roberto, who was holding Elena's head, looked at him. It's unclear what Miguel Dr. Roas intended to convey when he asked, "What are you trying to tell us?" However, the moment came to an end, and Miguel returned to his corner, where silence once again enveloped him. Paramedics came minutes later and took care of Elena while everyone tried to figure out what had happened. "It just happened. We need to take her to the hospital for a full evaluation," one of the paramedics stated. "My blood pressure is very high, so I'll go with her." Roberto didn't offer any. "Mr. Suarez will accompany his wife, and you, Mr. Roberto, and I are required to accompany him." Talk about Roberto appeared surprised by your nephew's response to you. "Being there," the doctor said. She gazed at him and the pictures, her eyes glued to him. Miguel remained in his corner, closely monitoring everything Dr. Roas observed as they rolled Elena out on the bed. Miguel softly asked, "Do you have a tight grip on one of the drawings he was working on? Can I see that?" The boy thought about it for a moment and then slowly held out the torn paper to her. The doctor carefully took it. She rubbed it smooth, and what she saw made her hold her breath. It was a drawing of a dark figure hunched over a crib with... She kept her eyes on the drawing while a smaller shadow watched Dr. Torres call Dr. Rouse. "I believe we need to hold an emergency meeting right away, and I need you to call Judge Ramirez right away." Dr. Rouse looked up from the drawing and asked her, "What's going on?" Roberto looked into his eyes and said, "That's exactly what we're going to find out, Mr. Roberto." "What will we discover in his corner?" Miguel started to rock gently, and his lips moved slowly as if he were speaking. He was practicing words that he wasn't yet ready to utter. The silence that had kept him safe for weeks was starting to break. The terrible truth struggled to emerge through those gaps. "We have scheduled the next meeting for next week." The hours after Elena's passing were a blur of events that promised to be far more telling than anyone thought. Going on at the detention center, Dr. Roas requested a quiet room to question Roberto, and Dr. Torres agreed. Miguel tried to cool down. "I don't understand why I have to stay," Roberto said as he sat awkwardly in a small office. "My sister is in the hospital with her husband," Dr. Roas said. "I need to prepare her notes." The social worker Sandra Gutierrez joined them with a big folder under her arm. "I have something important to talk about with you right away," she said. "The visit records you requested are available. You should clearly explain your role in the house after Ana Maria's birth." Roberto moved in his chair. "I already knew that. During the trial, I stated the following. I temporarily moved in to assist with the baby. Elena, in particular, needed assistance. Where did you sleep at night?" "I slept in the guest room next to Roberto, while he was stopped eating next to Ana." Dr. Roas made a note in Maria's room, and Miguel inquired about the location of his own room across the hall. Roberto answered in a tense voice, "Where are you going with this?" At that very moment, there was a knock on the door. It was Dr. Torres at the door, and he said, "Sorry for the delay, but Miguel is here." He changed his approach and began writing. Dr. Rouse stood up right away and asked, "What is he?" Torres answered, "I don't know what he's writing. He won't let us see the paper, but he hasn't done so yet." Roberto stood up and said, "I should leave now. You're not going anywhere." Dr. Rouse said this in a firm voice. "Lisa, could you stay with Mr. Roberto and Dr. Torres while I go see Miguel?" Miguel was sitting at the same table in the observation room, but this time he had a notebook in front of him. His hand moved. He quickly scribbled over the paper, repeatedly writing what appeared to be the same words. "Did you try to approach?" asked Rowe. Indeed, the nurse present in the room confirmed this. But he gets mad when people try to see him. What he's writing, Dr. Roos saw the boy through the glass. His stance was tense and protective, like he was watching over him. It was both a valuable and terrible secret at the same time. "I'm going in," she said, "but I need you to keep Roberto away from this area." Torres agreed, and the doctor walked into the room and said, "Hello." "Is it okay if I sit here?" she asked, moving away from him in a low voice. "With you?" Miguel didn't answer, but he also didn't seem upset, so the doctor saw this as a positive sign. Sitting on the other side of the table, she kept pulling out the drawing Miguel had given her earlier. "This drawing has been on my mind a lot." Miguel's hand paused for a moment as the small figure watched you, but then kept writing. Sometimes she kept writing. When we see things that really scare us, our brains tell us to be quiet to keep us safe, but silence can be very heavy. Sure enough, Miguel's writing got bigger and more frantic. The doctor's voice was soft but strong, and he would, "You'd like us to read what you're writing together." It was the first time since her arrival that Miguel looked up from the paper. With tears in his eyes, he whispered, "I can't." The doctor could barely hear him. "Why can't you, Miguel?" He threatened to harm Mom, but his words were unclear and difficult to understand. Glass Torres held his breath. Miguel had not spoken for weeks. "Who said that, Miguel?" Even though her heart was beating fast, she kept her voice cool. Miguel looked at the door with fear, as if he knew what was coming, to come in at any time. Miguel assured the doctor, "No one can hurt you here," as he gently pushed. She repeatedly wrote, "I'm sorry," in her notebook. "Ana Maria, I'm sorry I couldn't stop him. I'm also sorry for the immediate attention the doctor received." The last word had changed from "stop you" to "stop him, Miguel." "Who couldn't you?" she asked softly. Various sounds emanated from outside the room at that moment. Roberto's voice was easily recognizable. "I want to see my nephew, Miguel. I'm part of his family." He shrank in his chair, his face displaying fear. The doctor yelled at the glass, "Don't let him in!" But the damage had already occurred, was already done. Miguel had gone back to his state of silence, and his hands were shaking so badly that Dr. Roas quickly stood up. She pointed the glass at Torres and said, "I need you to call Judge Ramirez now. Have the cops look into it again. I think we have enough information." As she left the room, she took one last look. The boy had gone back to drawing, but this time his strokes were different. He wasn't drawing shadows over them. The crib had transformed into what appeared to be a closed door, with a small figure sitting in front of it, seemingly observing. The truth was slowly coming out, and Dr. Roas was starting to see how badly Miguel had been acting the whole time. There was noise now, but the next event was going to be even more disturbing than the previous one. The courtroom was fuller than when the media first heard the case of the child killer. got national attention, particularly after rumors spread about new developments in the investigation of Judge Ramirez. He looked at the papers in front of him through his glasses. The past few days have been filled with numerous emergencies. The case file now included new comments and disturbing drawings from a psychologist. Roberto Elena whispered to her husband that he had promised to arrive, but she was unsure of the exact time. Carlos responded, noticing that his wife still looked pale after being in the hospital. "Maybe he's on his way, doctor." "Roas," he said. She was sitting in the front row next to Dr. Torres, quickly going over the notes she had worked on all day and night. She was getting ready to testify because she knew what she would say today could change the outcome of the case. The judge opened the case by saying, "I'm striking my gavel. We are present for the review meeting. I know that the defense has new evidence to show in the case of State versus Miguel Angel Suarez Morales." Lawyer Mendoza stood up and said, "Yes, Your Honor. We ask that Dr. Patricia Ras presented her most current findings, and the judge gave the go-ahead." Dr. Ras walked to the podium. The sound of her heels echoed through the room as she took the oath. She then sat down and made her plans. During the paper's review, Dr. Roas Mendoza asked, "Could you please tell the court why you asked for this emergency hearing?" She replied while fixing her glasses. "For the past few weeks I've been writing about Miguel's behavior trends indicate a much more serious trauma than initially believed. More specifically, Miguel exhibits all the typical symptoms of what we refer to as selective traumatic silence. This is not the same as common selective mutism. This silence is caused by a stressful event or series of events that the patient feels they can't talk about." The prosecutor Rosales stood up and said, "Your Honor, during the first trial, Your Honor, we discussed the accused person's mental state." Dr. Rouse intervened. The judge could say, "I have new evidence that wasn't available at the first trial." The judge thought about this for a moment. "Do not change anything, doctor. Stick to the new results. Thank you very much." She pulled out a few drawings from her bag. These are new drawings by Miguel. They all follow the same pattern: a frightening figure hovering over a crib and a smaller figure representing Miguel. As the doctor asked Mendoza, "What does this mean?" "It means that Miguel wasn't the one who did it. The crime occurred, but she was present to witness it." There was a murmur in the room, and Elena struggled to keep her tears at bay. The doctor continued by saying that we had observed specific physical responses in Miguel when the room doors burst open and interrupted her. Roberto rushed in, his face wet with sweat. Traffic caused a delay, and Miguel immediately responded. He sat motionless next to his lawyer, beginning to shake. "Your Honor," Dr. Roas said, leaning forward, "this is exactly what I meant to watch, how Miguel reacted when his uncle showed up." Judge Ramirez watched with narrowed eyes. "Scene carefully, doctor." The prosecutor stepped in. "Are you suggesting that the uncle who is on trial has any involvement in the case?" The judge upheld Mendoza's speculative challenge to the case. Rosales, the prosecutor, did not interrupt the doctor during her presentation of evidence. Dr. Rosas pulled out more documents that Miguel started to write during the last meetings. He repeated one I kept repeating, "I'm sorry, Ana Maria. I couldn't stop him." "What relevance does that hold?" asked the prosecutor. "There has been a change in the text," the doctor initially responded to Miguel. He wrote, "Stop you," but in later works it became "Stop him." This, along with how he felt about the fact that Uncle was there, suggests a trend. The eerie silence that followed made everyone look at Roberto, who had clearly, "That's silly," Roberto said, standing up. "He's my nephew," I said. "Took care of Ana Maria order in court, where the judge hit him on the head." That's when Miguel's voice got quiet. It was quiet for a while, but then Elena brought her hands together. Carlos leaned forward and held his breath as he spoke. Miguel said, "Doctor." Rojas, softly, "Who are you protecting?" Miguel looked around, stopping at each familiar face until he got to his uncle. Roberto took a step toward him, but two court officers moved to block him. That night, Miguel's words kept going. "I saw someone in her room while she was shaking." "Whose room is it?" Miguel asked the judge as he leaned forward. Ana Maria started to cry, tears falling down Miguel's face. "I had previously witnessed his arrival at night. Who did you see coming in?" Dr. Rojas's voice was soft but strong, and Miguel shut his eyes tight. "Roberto, I had previously seen him with Maria Jose, your 4-year-old sister." Elena, despite already knowing the answer, let out a choked cry. Carlos jumped to his feet, his face red. Roberto, in his attempt to reach Miguel, uttered twisted lies. The judge instructed the police to detain the man for lying. Roberto was grabbed as he continued to yell, "Elena, tell them!" I observed the children as Elena stood motionless, her gaze firmly focused on her son. Years of small signs, and she rejected warnings like an avalanche, and Miguel Dr. Rojas kept her voice calm no matter what was going on. That night with Ana Maria, I tried to stop him, and Miguel's body shook with sobs. She wasn't breathing anymore when he left, but he was stronger. Elena's cry, "No, no, I just tried to help," echoed throughout the room. Miguel with the pillow, like on TV, and I tried to get her to breathe. Again, it didn't work, so Judge Ramirez took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes together. During his 30 years on the bench, he had rarely seen anything like this, Your Honor. Rosales, the prosecutor, stood up and demanded an immediate investigation into these accusations. The judge agreed. "Officers, take Mr. Roberto into arrest. As a prosecutor, I require a search warrant." Roberto immediately engaged in a fight with the police over his phone and computer. "You find it hard to believe that he is a killer. You found him guilty and told the judge to be quiet." The judge's voice was shaking with anger. "Mr. Roberto Morales, your investigations into their murder and child abuse are ongoing." As they took Roberto away, Miguel finally looked. He told his parents, "I'm sorry, I just wanted to protect them." Elena ran to him. When the police officer didn't try to stop her, she held her son in her arms and cried, "My child, my child." She gently rocked him repeatedly, just as she had done when he was a baby. Dr. Rojas quickly wiped away a tear from your eye. "Honor, I request the immediate release of Miguel and the provision of mental health care for his entire family." Judge Ramirez nodded. As the room began to fill, they firmly agreed upon it, and the doctor thanked him for not giving up. Miguel's silence had finally revealed the truth. It was a terrible and painful truth. It was a deal that exceeded everyone's expectations, allowing justice to finally be served. Prosecutor Rosales quickly. While the police led Roberto out of the room, he went up to the judge and said in a low voice, "Your Honor, the police." They just said they found something on Roberto Morales's phone, which means he had a second device in his. Judge Ramirez nodded gravely and said, "Go ahead with the investigation." The prosecutor and I agreed. "I want the police to protect the Suarez family, especially Maria Jose, who had joined Carlos in the middle of the room. With Elena and Miguel's embrace, the three of them formed a protective circle, seemingly attempting to keep each other at bay. From the horrible thing they had just found out about Mr. and Mrs. Suarez, Dr. Rojas kindly interrupted. "We need to take Miguel, and Maria Jose took some tests together, but Miguel clung to his mother even more tightly." "I don't want to be there," he said. "Being separated from them won't be necessary." Dr. Torres, who had just walked into the room, said, "We can do this at the hospital." Their parents were present to observe. Elena looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "Is Maria Jose okay?" Prosecutor Rosales left her with a neighbor and assured her, "The police are already at your house." Teacher Kaman, who had been watching her from her place, walked up to her as she was being taken to the hospital. She asked Miguel in a shy voice, "Do you remember that day at school when I found Miguel?" Slowly, Miguel nodded. "You wanted to tell me something that day, didn't you?" I asked. "You did." Miguel gulped. "He told me that if I told you about Uncle Roberto, Mom would be hurt." Carlos clenched his hands. "I'm going to." The judge stepped in and told Mr. Suarez, "I understand your anger, but your family needs you more than ever." Sandra Gutierrez, who was going over her notes, told the group, "There's something else we should look into. There are records that show Roberto lived at the house before Ana Maria was born." Elena got pale. "Yes, he did. When I was pregnant, he offered to help and told me I looked very tired. Oh my God." Carmen screamed as she recalled Maria Jose's absences. There were days when she didn't show up. She didn't go to school because she was sick, and Carlos always finished his work while Roberto stayed home to care for her. Miguel's voice broke, and he started to shake again. I attempted to remain awake during the viewing, but sometimes I couldn't hold on to my love. Elena hugged her son tighter. "None of this is your fault," she said. I went up to the judge and said, "Your Honor, I think we should end our case for today. It takes time to think about everything, and we need to come up with a good treatment plan." The judge agreed, but first his words to Miguel were, "Son, I want you to know that you were very brave. Not just today, but throughout these months, you have done everything within your power to ensure the safety of your family." Miguel looked at the judge. The judge cut her off with teary eyes. "Ana Maria, it wasn't your fault. When you were a child, you were attempting to protect your sisters from a monster. Justice will take care of him now." At that moment, a police officer rushed into the room and declared, "Your Honor, we found something in Roberto Morales's car." The judge noticed that people were taking pictures and videos outside the room. Dr. Roas knelt in front of the judge and lawyer, who had already left to gather the information. Miguel, do you remember when I told you that our brains tell us to be quiet to keep us safe?" The boy nodded. "Now I want you to understand something very important. You no longer have to keep quiet to protect us." "I promise to protect you," Miguel said in a low voice. "Yes," the doctor said, "and this time you won't be alone." Carlos placed his knees next to his own. "Son Miguel, please forgive me because your dad shouldn't have let me talk. No one believed him because of how strong his voice was. He fooled us all. It was easy for him to act like Elena was crying every night he offered to watch the kids. I thought he was helping us." Mrs. Suarez Sandra stepped in and said, "Don't torture yourself. Abusers are adept at controlling people. Right now, the most important thing for families is to focus on healing." Judge Ramirez came back into the room with a disturbed look on his face. Based on what he had just learned, the police have found a lot of proof. He told gravely the case will be the Special Crimes Unit sent him to examine the Suarez family. "I'm concerned that the scope of this situation may exceed our initial expectations. It appears that Roberto Morales is involved. In other cases similar to this, there was a profound silence in the room. The horror of what they were discovering seemed to intensify." "Right now, what's going on?" Elena asked in a shaking voice. "Right now," Dr. Rouse answered. Miguel said as he looked at the pictures that had helped, "We'll focus on getting better one step at a time." To uncover the truth, he grabbed a pencil and began to sketch something new: his family. As they stood together under a bright sun, the truth came out. The road to healing would be long, but silence made the days that followed extremely difficult. But at least they could walk through it together now that it wasn't as burdensome. The case of Miguel Suarez led to big changes in the juvenile justice system. Judge Ramirez, judges and specialists in children's law, deeply affected by the events, convened a special meeting to discuss the events. Miguel Suarez told his co-workers that it cannot happen again. We need stricter rules for cases. While the teens were at the Suarez home, the family was beginning the long process of rebuilding. Dr. Roas established a rigorous family therapy program. "Can I hang my new drawings?" Miguel asked one afternoon. Elena smiled the first time he showed her a collection of bright drawings he had made in art therapy. "My love, I haven't seen you smile like that in a long time. Where do you want to put them?" He informed her that it was Maria José's room, allowing her to admire the beautiful decor before heading out. González, the sleep detective, regularly checked in with the family to keep them informed about the probe. Eleni and Carlos were having coffee in the kitchen one afternoon, and she told them some important news. She spoke in a low voice to ensure the kids wouldn't hear that there were 3 more people on the network. Carlos is willing to work with the prosecutors in exchange for a shorter sentence, no matter what deal he makes. He gave a strong answer, vowing not to come near any child again as long as he could. He informed the detective that the charges against him would result in him spending the rest of his life in jail. Things were also changing. Teacher Carmen had developed a unique program that focused on the importance of safety. Telling someone when something is wrong, Miguel called me after class and asked if you could help me with something. "I was hoping you could assist me with a special project for my teacher. We're putting together a show about courage and truth." Miguel thought about it for a moment. "Do you think that would help other kids?" "I'm sure it would." Carmen answered with a soft smile. "Yes." Dr. Roas, who had arrived to collect Miguel for his weekly appointment, heard the answer. Talk is coming from the door. She intervened to remind Miguel, "Remember that you're not required to do anything that makes you feel uncomfortable." "I know," he replied, "but I want to help because I don't want any more kids." During dinner with my family that night, Maria José posed a question that surprised everyone. "Mom, can Ana Maria see us from heaven?" There was a tense silence at the table. Elena looked at Dr. Roas, they were having dinner together, and Maria José Miguel answered before anyone else could. "I think she can do it, and I think she's happy." Now that we were safe, the little girl appeared satisfied with the response and returned to her food. Elena squeezed her. Later that night, as Dr. Roas was preparing to leave, Miguel stopped her at the door. "Do you think I'll ever stop feeling guilty about what Miguel did by not speaking up sooner?" I asked in a low voice. If I had spoken up earlier with Maria José, the doctor would have been able to stand up straight. "Miguel, listen up. Please exercise caution, as you were a child confronting a terrifying situation. You did everything you could to keep your family safe. Roberto is to blame, but she did stop you every day in a gentle way. Every night you stayed alert and tried to keep your sisters safe. In every drawing you made, you tried to tell the truth. All of them showed love and courage." Miguel slowly nodded as he thought about what she said. After a moment he said, "I've been thoughts. When I grow up, I want to be like you. Indeed, I aspire to assist other children who are reluctant to share their experiences." Their truth. Dr. Roas felt tears coming to her eyes. "Miguel, you would excel in that role. You've already shown you that. Have a very wise heart." From the kitchen, Elena and Carlos watched the scene with tears in their eyes. He was carrying a heavy burden on his shoulders, and now he was talking about helping others that night. Miguel woke up to find Ana Maria's old room, now transformed into a playground, quiet. On the nightstand, a picture of his little sister smiled out of a frame adorned with his drawings. "I did it, Ana Maria," he said. Muttered, "I told you the truth. I miss you a lot, But I know you can now. Let him rest in peace. I no longer have to keep any lies from his parents." In the morning, Miguel Ángel Suárez Morales walked out into the light with his little sister by his side. Shadows had tormented him for an extended period, yet truth triumphed over fear, justice over manipulation, and although they couldn't bring Ana Maria back to life, they could at least honor her memory by delivering the truth and justice she deserved.